I walked into the glass conference room at Meridian Financial, my audit badge clipped to my navy blazer, and watched my former boss, Marcus Kellerman's face drain of all color. His coffee mug slipped from his fingers, shattering against the polished table as dark liquid spread across the quarterly reports he'd been pretending to review. "Hello, Marcus," I said, setting my briefcase down with deliberate precision. "I'm Sarah Chen, Senior Auditor from the Regulatory Compliance Division. I believe you know why I'm here." The other executives around the table shifted uncomfortably, but I kept my eyes locked on Marcus. After 3 years of being his scapegoat, watching him steal credit for my work while throwing me under the bus for his mistakes, I had dreamed of this moment. But even in my wildest fantasies, I never imagined it would feel this intoxicatingly perfect. Marcus's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Behind his wire-rimmed glasses, his eyes darted between me and the folder marked "Confidential Investigation" that I'd placed prominently on the table. "There must be some mistake," he stammered, his voice cracking on the last word. "I wasn't expecting—" "No mistake," I interrupted, opening the folder with a theatrical flourish. "The compliance department has received several anonymous tips regarding financial irregularities in the Pacific Northwest Division. As of today, this branch is under full audit investigation." I pulled out the official documentation, watching as Marcus's hands trembled slightly when he reached for his water glass. 3 years ago, I was a junior analyst in his department, grateful just to have a job out of college. I thought he was a mentor. I thought he cared about my career. How naive I had been. The memory of that final day still burned in my chest like acid. Standing in the HR office, listening to Marcus explain how I had independently made the decisions that led to a $2.3 million client loss. How I had gone rogue on the Patterson account. How I had consistently demonstrated poor judgment and insubordination. None of it was true. Every decision had been his. Every strategy had come from his mouth to my ears, with explicit instructions to execute them immediately. But when the Patterson deal went south, and the client threatened to pull their entire portfolio, Marcus needed someone to blame. Someone expendable. Someone like me. "The investigation will be comprehensive," I continued, savoring the way his Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. "We'll be examining all transactions, communications, and decision-making processes from the past 3 years. Full transparency will be required from all department heads." 3 years. The exact length of time I'd worked under him before he destroyed my career and had me blacklisted from every major firm in Seattle. But Marcus Kellerman had made one crucial mistake. He assumed that ruining me would be the end of my story. He never imagined that losing everything would become the catalyst for me to rebuild myself into something far more dangerous than the naive girl he'd crushed. As I spread the investigation timeline across the conference table, I thought back to that terrible day when my world had collapsed, and how it had ultimately led me here, to this moment of perfect, beautiful revenge. 3 years earlier, the morning I was fired started like any other. I arrived at the Meridian Financial Building at 6:45 a.m., a full hour and 15 minutes before official business hours began, clutching my usual venti coffee and mentally rehearsing my presentation for the Patterson Industries account review. Marcus had been very clear about the strategy. "Push for the aggressive growth portfolio," he'd said during our private meeting the week before. "Patterson is conservative by nature, but their CEO has been under pressure from the board to show bigger returns. This is our chance to land their entire pension fund management contract." The Patterson account represented $50 million in assets under management. Landing them would mean a massive bonus for our department and a probable promotion for me to senior analyst. After 18 months of working 80-hour weeks, sleeping in the office more often than my own apartment, and slowly paying off my crushing student loans, I was finally going to break through. Marcus met me in the elevator that morning, his usual paternal smile in place. "Ready for the big day, Sarah?" "Absolutely. I've run the numbers 12 different ways, and the projections look fantastic. Patterson's CFO specifically mentioned wanting to see annual returns in the 15 to 18% range, and our growth strategy should deliver exactly that." "That's my girl," he said, patting my shoulder in what I thought was an encouraging way. "Just remember, be confident, be aggressive, and don't let them talk you down to some boring conservative approach. They need us to push them out of their comfort zone." I nodded eagerly, my stomach fluttering with nervous excitement. This was it. This was my moment to prove myself. The presentation went exactly as we'd planned. Patterson's executive team listened intently as I walked them through our proposed aggressive growth strategy, highlighting the potential for 16 to 17% annual returns through strategic investments in emerging markets and high-growth tech sectors. Their CFO, Jennifer Walsh, asked pointed questions about risk management, and I provided the responses Marcus and I had prepared during our strategy sessions. "This is certainly ambitious," Walsh said, as I concluded the presentation. "Much more aggressive than our current approach." "Sometimes you have to take calculated risks to achieve exceptional results," I replied, echoing Marcus's words from our planning meetings. "We've done extensive analysis, and we're confident this strategy aligns with your board's growth objectives." The meeting ended with handshakes and promises to circle back within the week. Walking back to our offices, Marcus was practically glowing with pride. "Outstanding work, Sarah. That was exactly the kind of aggressive presentation we needed. Walsh is going to love those projected returns." But 3 days later, everything fell apart. Patterson Industries didn't just reject our proposal. They pulled their existing accounts and publicly criticized our reckless approach to fiduciary responsibility in a scathing letter to Meridian's executive leadership. The letter, which somehow made its way to the financial press, described our strategy as wildly inappropriate for a pension fund and suggested that Meridian Financial had lost sight of our conservative values. Within hours, the story was picked up by industry publications. "Meridian Financial accused of pushing risky pension strategy," read the headline in Financial Services Weekly. The article quoted liberally from Patterson's letter, painting our firm as cowboys who couldn't be trusted with retirees' nest eggs. I first learned about the disaster when I arrived at the office to find Marcus's assistant, Rebecca, waiting by my cubicle with tears in her eyes. "Sarah, Marcus wants to see you in his office immediately," she whispered. "HR is with him." The walk down the hall felt like a death march. Through the glass walls of Marcus's corner office, I could see him sitting rigidly behind his desk, his face grave. Across from him sat Janet Kim from Human Resources, her laptop open and fingers poised over the keyboard like a court stenographer, preparing to record an execution. "Please sit down, Sarah," Marcus said without looking up from the Patterson letter spread across his desk. I sank into the chair across from him, my mind racing. "Marcus, I know the Patterson situation looks bad, but maybe we can—" "Sarah." His voice was cold, completely different from the warm, mentoring tone I'd grown accustomed to. "I need you to explain to me how this happened." "What do you mean?" "We followed the strategy we discussed. You approved every element of the presentation. We agreed that—" "I approved nothing." He finally looked at me, and I was shocked by the hardness in his eyes. "According to my notes, I specifically advised a conservative approach for Patterson. You chose to ignore that advice and pursue an aggressive strategy against my explicit instructions." The words hit me like a physical blow. Marcus, that's not what happened. We had multiple meetings about this. You told me to push for aggressive growth. You said, "I have documentation of our conversations, Sarah." He slid a manila folder across the desk. "My emails to you clearly outlined a conservative approach. Your responses show that you understood my direction but chose to disregard it." With trembling fingers, I opened the folder. Inside were printouts of email exchanges I'd never seen before. Messages that appeared to be from my company account, but which I'd never written. Emails where I argued for aggressive strategies while Marcus patiently advised caution. "This isn't real," I whispered, staring at my own name on emails I'd never sent. "Marcus, these emails. I never wrote these. You know I never wrote these." "Are you suggesting these emails were fabricated?" Janet's voice was sharp, professional. "That's a very serious accusation, Sarah." "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you that I never sent these emails. Every conversation Marcus and I had about Patterson, he instructed me to be aggressive. He told me to push for higher returns. Sarah." Marcus's voice carried a note of what sounded like disappointment, but I could see something else flickering in his eyes. Something that looked almost like satisfaction. "I understand this is difficult, but the evidence is clear. You made an independent decision to pursue a high-risk strategy, despite my guidance toward a more conservative approach. That decision has cost this firm not just the Patterson account, but significant reputational damage. But I was following your instructions. I could hear the desperation in my own voice. Every single element of that presentation was approved by you. You sat in on the practice sessions. You coached me on how to respond to their questions about risk management. Janet was typing furiously on her laptop, recording every word. Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying me with the kind of detached interest you might show a bug under a microscope. Sarah, I think the stress of this situation may be affecting your memory. The documentation clearly shows that you were advised to take a conservative approach and you chose to do otherwise. Now we can handle this quietly. I want to see the metadata on those emails. The words came out sharper than I'd intended. If you're claiming I sent messages I don't remember sending, then I want to see the full technical details. Date stamps, IP addresses, everything. Marcus and Janet exchanged a look. Something passed between them, some kind of silent communication that made my stomach drop. Sarah, Janet said slowly, are you questioning the integrity of the company's email system? I'm questioning why I'm looking at emails I never sent, discussing strategies I never proposed, while being blamed for a presentation that followed the exact instructions my supervisor gave me. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus straightened some papers on his desk, not meeting my eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Effective immediately, you're being terminated for gross insubordination and failure to follow direct supervisory guidance. You'll have 30 minutes to clear out your desk. Rebecca will escort you. The words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. Marcus, please. You know this isn't fair. You know what really happened. For just a moment, his mask slipped. I saw something in his expression. Not guilt exactly, but acknowledgement. He knew. He knew exactly what he was doing to me. I'm sorry it came to this, Sarah. I really am. But he wasn't sorry, not even a little bit. 27 minutes later, I walked out of the Meridian Financial building carrying a cardboard box with 3 years of my professional life inside it. My company laptop, my security badge, my business cards, all confiscated. My access to the building, the email system, even the employee parking garage, all revoked. I stood on the sidewalk in the Seattle drizzle, watching my former colleagues through the floor-to-ceiling windows and tried to process what had just happened. 3 days ago, I was on the verge of my first major promotion. Now I was unemployed, professionally destroyed, and somehow responsible for a disaster I didn't create. The worst part wasn't the job loss. It wasn't even the humiliation of being escorted out like a criminal. The worst part was the growing realization that Marcus had planned this. The emails, the documentation, the narrative that painted me as an insubordinate rogue who'd ignored supervision. It was all too neat, too complete. Marcus Kellerman had systematically set me up to take the fall for his mistakes, and I'd been too trusting, too naive to see it coming. But as I stood there in the rain, clutching my cardboard box of personal effects, I made myself a promise. This wasn't over. Somehow, some way, I was going to make sure Marcus Kellerman paid for what he'd done to me, and I just had no idea it would take 3 years and a complete transformation of my entire life to make that promise come true. The months following my termination were the darkest of my life. Word traveled fast in Seattle's tight-knit financial community, and Marcus's version of events that I'd gone rogue on a major client and caused significant reputational damage preceded me to every interview. We've heard you had some difficulties at your previous position, became the standard opening line. No matter how I tried to explain what had really happened, I could see the skepticism in hiring managers' eyes. My version sounded exactly like what every fired employee claimed, that it wasn't really their fault, that they'd been set up, that their supervisor had thrown them under the bus. Without documentation to support my claims, it was my word against Marcus's. And Marcus had the weight of Meridian Financial's reputation behind him, while I had nothing but a story that sounded like sour grapes from a disgruntled former employee. After 6 months of rejections, I was forced to take a minimum wage job at a coffee shop just to pay rent on my studio apartment. My student loan payments went into forbearance. My savings evaporated. I sold my car and started taking the bus everywhere, watching my former colleagues drive past in their BMWs and Mercedes on their way to jobs I'd never be allowed to have again. The isolation was almost worse than the financial hardship. My phone stopped ringing. Former colleagues who I'd considered friends suddenly became too busy to meet for drinks. The professional network I'd spent years building dissolved overnight as if I'd never existed. But it was during those long, humiliating months that I started to develop something I'd never had before: a crystal clear sense of purpose. I spent my evenings in the Seattle Public Library researching Marcus's career and Meridian Financial's history. I learned about other employees who'd left the company under questionable circumstances, other deals that had gone bad, other scapegoats who'd been quietly discarded when convenient. Marcus had a pattern. Every 2 to 3 years, someone in his department would be fired for poor performance or failure to follow procedures, usually right after a major deal went south. Always someone young, always someone without the political connections to fight back effectively. I also discovered something interesting about Marcus's own rise through the company ranks. He'd joined Meridian Financial 12 years earlier as a mid-level analyst, the same position I'd held when he destroyed me, but his advancement had been meteoric, almost suspiciously fast. Senior analyst within 18 months, department head within 3 years, vice president by year 5. That kind of rapid promotion usually meant either exceptional performance or exceptional manipulation. Given what he'd done to me, I was betting on the latter. But knowing the truth and proving it were two different things. Even if I could document Marcus's pattern of scapegoating subordinates, I had no way to leverage that information. I was locked out of the financial industry, professionally radioactive, with no platform to expose what I'd learned. That's when I started thinking about auditing. The idea came to me during one of my late-night research sessions. I was reading about a corruption scandal at a major investment firm that had been exposed not by journalists or whistleblowers, but by a routine regulatory audit. The auditor who'd uncovered the fraud was quoted in the article, "People think auditing is boring, but there's nothing more exciting than following a paper trail that leads to the truth." Auditors had access to everything: financial records, emails, internal communications, decision-making processes, all the evidence I'd need to prove what Marcus had done to me and others. More importantly, auditors had legal authority to demand answers and documentation. They couldn't be stonewalled or dismissed the way a disgruntled former employee could. The path wasn't easy. I needed a master's degree in accounting, professional certifications, and several years of experience before I could qualify for a regulatory auditing position. But I had something most people didn't: absolute clarity about my ultimate goal. I enrolled in night classes at Seattle University, working at the coffee shop during the day and studying until 2 a.m. every night. I took out additional student loans to pay for tuition, accepting that my debt would grow even larger, but knowing it was an investment in my future revenge. The coursework was brutal: accounting principles, financial analysis, regulatory frameworks, audit procedures, subjects I'd never studied before but needed to master completely. My classmates were mostly working professionals looking to advance their existing careers. I was a coffee shop employee trying to entirely rebuild my professional identity. But I had advantages they didn't. I understood the financial industry from the inside, having worked in it for 3 years. I knew how deals were structured, how internal communications flowed, where the bodies were buried. Most importantly, I had motivation that none of my classmates could match. Every time I wanted to quit, and there were many such moments, I thought about Marcus sitting in his corner office, probably destroying another young analyst's career to cover for his own mistakes. I thought about the smug satisfaction in his eyes when he'd fired me, and how certain he'd seemed that I would simply disappear. 2 years into my accounting program, I started applying for entry-level positions at auditing firms. The work was tedious at first: verifying expense reports, checking inventory counts, reviewing basic financial statements for small businesses. But I was building experience and learning the methodical, systematic approach that would eventually make me dangerous to people like Marcus. My break came in my 3rd year when I was hired as a junior auditor at Cromwell and Associates, a mid-sized firm that handled regulatory compliance work for financial institutions. The pay was decent, the work was challenging, and most importantly, I was finally building expertise in the specific area I needed: financial services auditing. I threw myself into the job with an intensity that probably worried my supervisors. I volunteered for the most complex assignments, studied case law during my lunch breaks, and built relationships with regulators at the state and federal level. Within 18 months, I'd earned promotions to staff auditor, then senior auditor. But I wasn't just building a career. I was building the tools I would need to destroy Marcus Kellerman. Along the way, I discovered something interesting about myself. I was actually brilliant at auditing. The systematic approach, the attention to detail, the ability to see patterns in large amounts of data, skills I'd never known I possessed emerged naturally. I began to understand why that auditor had described following a paper trail as exciting. There was something deeply satisfying about uncovering hidden truths, about bringing order to chaos, about making powerful people answer for their actions. My supervisors began sending me on more sensitive assignments. Corporate fraud investigations, regulatory compliance audits for major firms, complex financial reconstructions where millions of dollars had gone missing. I developed a reputation for being thorough, relentless, and impossible to fool. Sarah has a gift for finding what people don't want found, my manager David Cromwell told a client during one particularly complex embezzlement case. If there's something wrong with your books, she'll find it. And she'll document it so thoroughly that no lawyer in the world will be able to argue with her conclusions. 3 years after Marcus Kellerman destroyed my career, I had built myself into exactly the kind of professional he should be most afraid of. I had the skills, the credentials, the legal authority, and most importantly, the access to bring down someone who'd been hiding behind corporate protection and fabricated documentation. All I needed was the opportunity. That opportunity came on a Tuesday morning in March when David walked into my office with a new assignment folder. "High priority job from the State Regulatory Office," he said, setting the folder on my desk. "Meridian Financial, Pacific Northwest Division. Multiple anonymous complaints about financial irregularities and management practices. They want our most experienced auditor on this one." I stared at the folder without touching it, my heart hammering so hard I was sure David could hear it. "Sarah, is everything okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." I forced myself to speak calmly. "I used to work at Meridian, about 4 years ago. Is that a problem?" David considered this for a moment. "Depends. Any conflicts of interest I should know about?" "No conflicts," I said. "Actually, my previous experience there might be helpful for understanding their internal processes." That was the understatement of the century. David nodded approvingly. "Perfect. You know the company culture, you understand their systems. This should be a straightforward assignment for you. When can you start?" I looked down at the folder, thinking about Marcus probably sitting in his corner office at that very moment, completely unaware that his past was about to catch up with him. "I can start immediately." The morning I walked back into Meridian Financial as a senior auditor was the sweetest moment of my professional life. I'd spent weeks preparing for this investigation, reviewing regulatory codes, studying Meridian's corporate structure, and mapping out the most efficient approach to uncovering whatever irregularities had triggered the anonymous complaints. But more than that, I'd spent 3 years preparing for this moment. Every late night studying accounting principles, every weekend spent reviewing audit procedures, every professional certification I'd earned, all of it had been leading to this single opportunity to confront the man who'd tried to destroy me. I arrived at 8 a.m. sharp, dressed in my best Navy suit and carrying a leather briefcase that cost more than I used to make in a month at the coffee shop. The security guard in the lobby checked my credentials and issued me a visitor's badge, the same routine I'd gone through hundreds of times as an employee. But now I was here as an auditor, armed with legal authority to demand any document, any communication, any piece of evidence I needed. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt like ascending to Mount Olympus. Through the glass walls, I could see my former department bustling with activity. Some faces were familiar, colleagues who'd avoided eye contact with me during my final weeks, who'd pretended not to see me packing up my desk. Others were new, probably fresh graduates who'd taken positions similar to the one I'd held. Rebecca, Marcus's assistant, was still at her desk outside his corner office. She looked up when the elevator opened, and for a moment, I saw recognition flicker across her face. Then confusion, as she tried to process why I was there wearing a visitor's badge instead of fleeing the building in disgrace. "Good morning, Rebecca," I said pleasantly. "I'm here to see Mr. Kellerman about the regulatory audit." Her eyes widened. "You're the auditor?" Senior Auditor Sarah Chen from Cromwell and Associates. We have an 8:30 appointment. I watched her internal struggle play out across her face. She clearly remembered me, but she also had to follow professional protocol. After a moment of hesitation, she picked up her phone. Mr. Kellerman, the auditor from Cromwell and Associates is here to see you. I couldn't hear his response, but I watched Rebecca's eyebrows rise slightly. Yes, sir, Sarah Chen. A pause. Should I? Yes, sir, right away. She hung up and looked at me with something that might have been sympathy. He'll see you now. I walked past her desk, my heels clicking confidently on the polished floor, and pushed open the door to Marcus's office. He was standing behind his desk, clearly trying to project authority and control. But I could see the shock in his eyes, the way his hand trembled slightly, as he gestured toward the conference table. Miss Chen, he said, his voice carefully modulated, this is unexpected. Is it? I set my briefcase down and began removing documents. Anonymous complaints about financial irregularities typically trigger regulatory audits. I'm surprised your compliance department didn't warn you this was coming. Marcus moved to the conference table, but he remained standing while I took a seat and spread out my materials. The power dynamic was immediately clear. I was here to work, while he was scrambling to figure out how to handle an impossible situation. I wasn't aware that you'd moved into auditing, he said carefully. People change careers all the time. I opened my laptop and pulled up the investigation framework I'd prepared. After I left Meridian, I discovered I had a real aptitude for forensic accounting. It's amazing what you learn when you start following paper trails systematically. The subtle threat landed exactly as I'd intended. Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Well, he said, settling into a chair across from me. I'm sure you'll find everything in order. We run a very tight ship here. I'm sure you do. I pulled out a digital recorder and placed it on the table between us. I'd like to start with some general questions about your management philosophy and decision-making processes. For the record, please state your name and position. Marcus Kellerman, Vice President, Pacific Northwest Division. His voice was steady, but I could see sweat beginning to form along his hairline. Thank you, Mr. Kellerman. How long have you been in your current position? Approximately 7 years. And in that time, how many direct reports have left the company? He blinked, clearly not expecting that particular question. I'm sorry? Staff turnover in your division. How many analysts, associates, and senior staff have left Meridian during your tenure as VP? I don't have those numbers memorized. You'd need to check with HR for specifics. I made a note on my legal pad. Approximately how many? More than 10? More than 20? Maybe 15 or 20 over 7 years. That's fairly normal turnover in this industry. 15 or 20. I wrote that down as well. And how many of those departures were voluntary resignations versus terminations? Marcus shifted in his chair. Again, you'd need to check with HR for specific details. But you would remember the terminations, wouldn't you? As the supervising manager, you would have been directly involved in those decisions. Well, yes, but... So, approximately how many terminations have you initiated during your 7 years as VP? The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds. I could practically see the gears turning in Marcus's head as he tried to calculate how much I might already know. Perhaps 8 or 10, he said finally. I nodded and made another note. 8 or 10 terminations over 7 years. That's roughly 1 per year. Were these terminations typically related to performance issues? Performance or conduct issues, yes. Can you describe the general pattern of these performance issues? I'm not sure what you mean. I looked up from my notes and met his eyes directly. Well, for instance, were these typically long-term performance problems that developed over months or years? Or were they more sudden, situations where an employee's performance declined rapidly or they made significant errors on important projects? Marcus was sweating visibly now. Each situation was unique. Of course, but were there any common factors? Similar types of mistakes, similar timing in relation to difficult client situations, similar documentation issues? I'm not sure I understand the relevance of these questions to a financial audit. Management practices and decision-making processes are directly relevant to financial oversight, I replied smoothly, particularly when we're investigating potential irregularities. For instance, If there's a pattern of employees being terminated shortly after major client losses, that might suggest issues with supervision, training, or internal controls. Marcus was trapped and he knew it. He couldn't refuse to answer without looking evasive, but every answer was potentially damaging. I pride myself on holding staff accountable for their decisions, he said finally. When someone makes choices that harm the company, there have to be consequences. Absolutely. Accountability is crucial. I flipped to a new page in my notebook. Can you walk me through your typical process for documenting employee decisions that might require disciplinary action? Documentation. Email records, meeting notes, written warnings, the paper trail that supports termination decisions. I assume you maintain thorough documentation, given the legal implications of wrongful termination claims. Marcus was quiet for so long that I wondered if he was going to answer at all. We follow all HR procedures, he said eventually. Excellent. I'll want to review those documentation practices as part of the audit. Now let's talk about the anonymous complaints that triggered this investigation. I pulled out a summary sheet I'd prepared based on the regulatory filing. The complaints allege potential financial irregularities, including possible misrepresentation of investment performance, improper documentation of client communications, and potential conflicts of interest in account management. Do any of these areas ring a bell? No. The answer came too quickly, too emphatically. No. These are fairly broad categories. You haven't had any concerns about investment performance reporting in your division. Our performance reporting is accurate and compliant with all regulations. I made a note. What about client communications? Any concerns there? None. Another note. Conflicts of interest? Absolutely not. I set down my pen and leaned back in my chair, studying Marcus's face. He was giving me textbook defensive responses, categorical denials with no nuance or detail. In auditing, that was often a red flag indicating the subject had something to hide. Mr. Kellerman, I want to be very clear about the audit process. Over the next several weeks, I'll be reviewing financial records, client communications, internal documents, and personnel files going back approximately 5 years. I'll be interviewing current and former employees, examining transaction records, and analyzing any documentation related to account management and performance reporting. I paused, letting that sink in. If there are any irregularities, any documentation issues, any practices that might not comply with regulatory standards, they will be discovered. It would be much better for everyone involved if you're proactive about identifying potential concerns now, rather than having me uncover them during the investigation. Marcus stared at me across the table, and I could see him calculating his options. He knew I was no longer the naive young analyst he'd been able to manipulate and destroy. He was facing someone with legal authority, professional expertise, and most dangerously, personal knowledge of his methods. I appreciate your thoroughness, he said carefully, but I'm confident that your investigation will find everything in order. I smiled and began packing up my materials. I hope you're right, Marcus. I really do. As I stood to leave, I could see him struggling with whether to say something more, perhaps to acknowledge our shared history, or attempt some kind of personal appeal. But what could he possibly say? That he was sorry for destroying my career? That he hoped I'd be objective despite what he'd done to me? Instead, he simply stood and walked me to the door. Rebecca will provide you with whatever office space and administrative support you need, he said. Thank you. I'll be working closely with your IT department to access email archives and electronic records. I trust that won't be a problem. Of course not. I shook his hand firmly, professionally. I look forward to a very thorough and comprehensive investigation. Walking back to the elevator, I felt a surge of satisfaction so intense it was almost overwhelming. After 3 years of careful preparation, I was finally in position to uncover the truth about Marcus Kellerman. Not just what he'd done to me, but what he'd done to others and what he was probably still doing. The scared, helpless young woman who'd been escorted out of this building with a cardboard box was gone forever. In her place stood a highly trained, legally empowered professional with the skills and authority to expose every lie, every manipulation, every piece of fabricated evidence that Marcus had used to protect himself at others' expense. As the elevator doors closed, I caught a glimpse of Marcus through his office windows. He was standing motionless behind his desk, staring at nothing, probably beginning to understand that his career was about to be dissected by someone who knew exactly where to look for the bodies. The investigation was just beginning, but in my heart, I already knew how it would end. Marcus Kellerman had taught me that documentation was everything, that evidence was power, and that the right paper trail could destroy someone completely. Now I was going to teach him the same lesson. The first week of my investigation was dedicated to establishing scope and gathering preliminary documentation. I set up a temporary office in Meridian's compliance department, with access to their network, document management systems, and personnel records. Rebecca had been assigned as my administrative liaison, which created an interesting dynamic. She clearly remembered our previous relationship, but was now required to help me investigate her boss. "I'll need email archives for all staff in the Pacific Northwest Division going back 5 years," I told her on my second day. "That includes current employees and anyone who's left during that period." Rebecca nodded and made a note. "That's a lot of emails. It might take the IT department a few days to compile everything." "That's fine. While they're working on that, I'll start with the personnel files. I'll need documentation for all terminations in the division during Mr. Kellerman's tenure as VP." I watched her face carefully as I said this. Rebecca had been Marcus's assistant for the entire 7 years he'd been VP. She'd scheduled the meetings where employees were fired, typed the documentation that justified those terminations, and walked the condemned down to HR for their final conversations. If anyone knew about patterns of abuse, it would be her. "All terminations?" she asked quietly. "All of them. Personnel files, termination documentation, exit interviews if they exist, and any related correspondence." Rebecca was quiet for a moment, her fingers drumming nervously on her desk. Finally, she looked up at me with something that might have been resolve. "There are a lot of files," she said. "Maybe I should start with the most recent ones and work backwards." It was a reasonable suggestion, but something in her tone caught my attention. "Why don't we start with the most complex cases instead? The ones that might have the most documentation." Rebecca nodded slowly. "I can think of a few that had extensive documentation." 2 hours later, she delivered a stack of personnel files to my temporary office. 8 terminations over 7 years, just as Marcus had claimed. But as I began reviewing the documentation, patterns began to emerge that made my pulse quicken with anticipation. The first file belonged to Jennifer Martinez, a senior analyst who'd been terminated 3 years ago, about 6 months before my own firing. According to the documentation, Jennifer had independently pursued an unauthorized investment strategy for a major client, resulting in significant losses and a damaged relationship. The parallels to my own case were striking. Like me, Jennifer had been described as acting against explicit supervisory guidance. Like me, she'd supposedly ignored multiple warnings about her approach. And like me, her termination had coincided perfectly with a major client loss that required someone to blame. But it was the email evidence that made my hands shake with excitement. Jennifer's personnel file contained printed copies of email exchanges between her and Marcus, showing a clear pattern of her advocating for risky investments while he advised caution and restraint. The emails painted Jennifer as reckless and insubordinate, while Marcus appeared thoughtful and protective of client interests. I pulled out my laptop and began comparing the language, phrasing, and argumentative structure in Jennifer's emails with my own fabricated correspondence from 3 years ago. The similarities were remarkable, too remarkable to be coincidental. Both sets of emails showed the terminated employee using identical phrases to justify risk-taking. Both showed Marcus responding with nearly identical cautious language. Both followed the same narrative arc from initial disagreement to escalating conflict to final insubordination. Either Jennifer Martinez and I had developed identical writing styles and identical approaches to arguing with our supervisor, or someone had used the same template to fabricate evidence against both of us. I opened the second file. David Park terminated 2.5 years ago for failure to follow established protocols on a client portfolio rebalancing project. Again, the documentation showed David pursuing an independent strategy that Marcus had allegedly advised against. Again, there were emails showing David arguing for his approach while Marcus counseled restraint. And again, the language was strikingly similar to both Jennifer's emails and my own. By the time I'd reviewed all 8 files, I had identified clear patterns in both the termination narratives and the supporting documentation. Every single fired employee had supposedly acted independently against Marcus's explicit guidance, pursued strategies that Marcus had documented himself as opposing, caused client losses or relationship damage through their insubordination, engaged in email exchanges that followed nearly identical argumentative patterns. The probability that 8 different people would naturally write in such similar styles, make such similar arguments, and choose such similar words when disagreeing with their supervisor was essentially zero. Marcus hadn't just fabricated evidence against me. He'd been systematically framing subordinates for his own mistakes for years, using the same playbook each time. And because each victim was destroyed individually, fired, blacklisted, and isolated, none of us had been able to compare notes and identify the pattern, but now I could see the whole picture, and it was even worse than I'd imagined. I spent the next 3 days diving deeper into each case, cross-referencing the termination dates with client losses, stock market events, and regulatory changes that might have contributed to poor performance. In every single instance, the problems that led to each employee's firing could be traced to broader market conditions or strategic decisions that would have originated at the VP level or higher. Jennifer Martinez had been fired for investment losses that occurred during a general market downturn that affected all growth-oriented portfolios. David Park had been terminated for protocol violations during a period when Meridian was implementing new compliance standards company-wide. Lisa Chen, no relation, had been blamed for a client relationship breakdown that coincided with that client's own internal management changes. In each case, the underlying problems were systemic or market-driven, not the result of individual employee decisions. But in each case, Marcus had managed to isolate one person as responsible and document their insubordination through suspiciously similar email evidence. On Thursday afternoon, I requested a meeting with Rebecca to discuss my preliminary findings. I need to understand the email documentation process, I told her. When employees like Jennifer Martinez or David Park were terminated, how were these email exchanges compiled and preserved? Rebecca shifted uncomfortably in her chair. I'm not sure I understand what you're asking. The emails in their personnel files. They're printed copies, not electronic archives. Who decided which emails to include? Who gathered them and formatted them for the documentation? Mr. Kellerman would identify the relevant communications and have me print them out for the files. So Marcus selected which emails to include in the termination documentation? Well, yes. As their supervisor, he would know which communications were most relevant to the performance issues. I nodded thoughtfully. And you would print them directly from his computer? Sometimes. Or he would forward them to me to print. Did you ever print emails directly from the terminated employees' accounts? Rebecca was quiet for a long moment. I don't think so. Mr. Kellerman always provided the emails that needed to be documented. Always, in all 8 termination cases. Yes, I believe so. I leaned forward. Rebecca, in your 7 years as Mr. Kellerman's assistant, did you ever notice similarities between these termination cases? Similar language in the documentation? Similar patterns in the email exchanges? She looked genuinely uncomfortable now, glancing toward Marcus's office, as if he might be listening through the walls. I just do what I'm asked to do, she said quietly. It's not my job to analyze these things. But I could see in her eyes that she had noticed the patterns. She'd been typing the same template emails, printing the same fabricated evidence, and filing the same manufactured documentation for years. She just hadn't wanted to acknowledge what she was participating in. Rebecca, I said gently, if there were irregularities in these termination procedures, if documentation had been altered or fabricated, would you want to help make that right? She stared at her hands for nearly a minute. When she finally looked up, there were tears in her eyes. Those people, she whispered. Jennifer and David and the others. They were good people, good employees. I never understood why they would suddenly start acting the way the emails made it seem like they were acting. What do you mean? Jennifer was always so careful, so detail-oriented. She would never just ignore Mr. Kellerman's advice and do something reckless. But the emails made it look like that's exactly what she did. Did you ever see Jennifer writing those emails? Did you witness the conversations they were supposedly documenting? Rebecca shook her head. The emails always seemed to be sent when I was away from my desk, or late at night, or over weekends. I would just see them when Mr. Kellerman had me print them out for the files. I felt a surge of excitement so intense I had to work to keep my voice steady. Rebecca, I need to ask you something very important. Did Mr. Kellerman ever have you print emails that you knew the employees hadn't actually sent? Another long pause, then so quietly I almost couldn't hear her. I think you should talk to Jennifer Martinez. Finding Jennifer Martinez took 3 phone calls and a careful explanation of who I was and why I was reaching out. Like me, she'd been effectively blacklisted from the Seattle financial community after her termination from Meridian. Unlike me, she'd moved to Portland and started over in a completely different industry, event planning. We met at a coffee shop downtown, both of us wary and uncertain. Jennifer was a small woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and graying hair that made her look older than her 42 years. She listened without interruption as I explained my audit investigation and what I'd discovered about the pattern of terminations in Marcus's division. "I've been wondering when someone would figure this out," she said when I finished. 8 people over 7 years, all with the same story, all with the same kind of email evidence. It was too neat, too convenient. "Did you send the emails that were used to document your termination?" Jennifer laughed bitterly. "I never sent a single one of them. But try explaining that to a hiring manager when you're interviewing for a new job." "Oh, those emails that show me arguing with my boss and ignoring his advice? Those were completely fabricated." "Sure, that sounds credible." "How do you know you didn't send them? Is it possible you forgot or—" "I know I didn't send them because I save copies of every work email I send. And I had copies of my actual exchanges with Marcus about the Hartwell Industries account. The real emails showed him instructing me to pursue exactly the strategy that I implemented. The fake emails showed the opposite." My heart started racing. "You have copies of the actual emails?" "I had them. When I was fired, I tried to use them to appeal the termination. I brought them to HR and showed them the discrepancies between my saved emails and the ones in my personnel file." "What happened?" Jennifer's expression darkened. "HR told me that my personal copies weren't reliable evidence, since they could have been easily altered on my personal computer. They said the company's official email archives were more trustworthy than anything I could produce independently." "But they were the real emails?" "They were absolutely the real emails. I had date stamps, server headers, the whole thing. But Marcus was a VP, and I was a terminated employee with an obvious motive to lie." Guess which version HR chose to believe? I pulled out my laptop and opened one of the personnel files I'd been reviewing. "Jennifer, I want to show you something. These are the emails that were used to document David Park's termination 2.5 years ago." I turned the screen toward her and watched her face as she read through the fabricated correspondence. Her eyes widened as she recognized the language patterns, the argumentative structure, the specific phrases that appeared in her own fake emails. "Jesus Christ," she whispered. "It's the same template, the same fucking template he used on me. And on David Park, and on Lisa Chen, and on me, and probably on everyone else he's fired over the years." Jennifer leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. "You know what the most twisted part is? Marcus is actually terrible at his job. Half the strategies he forced me to implement were outdated or inappropriate for the client's risk profile. But when they didn't work out, he needed someone to blame. So he would just rewrite history to make it look like the bad decisions came from us." "Can you prove that? Do you still have documentation of what really happened with your accounts?" "Some of it. I kept copies of client communications, research reports, things like that. Nothing that would definitively prove the emails were fake, but enough to show that my actual recommendations were sound and that the problems were caused by broader market conditions." I closed my laptop and leaned forward. "Jennifer, how would you feel about providing a formal statement for my audit investigation?" She was quiet for a long time, studying my face. "This is really happening. You're actually going to expose what he did." "I'm going to document every instance of fabricated evidence, every pattern of abuse, every lie he's told to destroy people's careers. And then I'm going to compile it all into an audit report that will be reviewed by state regulators and Meridian's executive leadership." "And you think they'll believe you? You think they'll care?" I think they'll have no choice. I'm not a disgruntled employee making accusations. I'm a licensed auditor conducting a formal regulatory investigation. I have legal authority to compel documentation, interview witnesses, and demand explanations for irregularities. If Marcus has been fabricating evidence and engaging in systematic abuse, I will prove it conclusively. Jennifer smiled for the first time since we'd sat down. In that case, absolutely. I'll provide whatever statements you need. It's about time someone held that bastard accountable. Over the next 2 hours, Jennifer walked me through her entire experience at Meridian. The real version, not the fabricated narrative that had been used to justify her termination. She described Marcus's management style, his habit of giving contradictory instructions and then blaming subordinates when things went wrong, his pattern of taking credit for successes while scapegoating others for failures. But most importantly, she provided specific details about the Hartwell Industries account that had been the pretext for her firing. Details that directly contradicted the official narrative and supported her claim that the documented emails were complete fabrications. Marcus told me explicitly to recommend the growth portfolio, she explained. Hartwell's CFO had mentioned in our initial meeting that they were disappointed with their current returns and wanted to see more aggressive growth strategies. Marcus said it was exactly the kind of opportunity we should be pursuing. But the emails in your file show you arguing for the growth portfolio while Marcus advised caution? Complete bullshit. Marcus was the one pushing for aggressive strategies. I was actually the one who raised concerns about the risk level, but he overruled me. Said I was being too conservative and that we needed to show Hartwell we could deliver the returns they wanted. Do you remember the specific conversation where he gave you those instructions? Jennifer nodded. It was in his office the day before our presentation to Hartwell. Rebecca was there too. She was taking notes for the client meeting preparation. Marcus was very explicit about wanting to position ourselves as growth-oriented advisors who could deliver superior returns. I made careful notes of everything Jennifer told me, knowing that each detail could be corroborated through other sources or witnesses. But more than the specific facts, I was struck by how familiar her story sounded. The same pattern of manipulation, the same reversal of responsibility, the same systematic destruction of a promising career. As we prepared to leave, Jennifer grabbed my arm. Sarah, be careful. Marcus is not going to just sit back and let you expose him. He's been doing this for years because he's good at protecting himself and destroying anyone who threatens him. Don't underestimate what he's capable of. I smiled grimly. Jennifer, I spent 3 years preparing for this moment. I've built my entire career around having the skills and authority to take down someone exactly like Marcus Kellerman. Trust me, I'm ready for whatever he tries. But as I drove back to Seattle, I couldn't shake the feeling that Jennifer's warning was more prescient than I wanted to admit. Marcus had survived and thrived for years by being ruthless and manipulative. Now that I'd cornered him, he was going to fight back with everything he had. The question was, had 3 years of preparation been enough to make me stronger than the man who'd once destroyed me so easily? I was about to find out. My investigation entered a new phase the following Monday when I returned to Meridian Financial with Jennifer Martinez's formal statement and a much more aggressive approach to document analysis. I'd spent the weekend reviewing audit procedures for cases involving potential evidence fabrication, and I knew exactly what I needed to do to build an unassailable case against Marcus. The first step was gaining access to the email server archives that contained the actual electronic records, not just the printed copies that Marcus had selected and provided. If he'd been fabricating correspondence, there would be discrepancies between the server records and the documented evidence in personnel files. I need complete email archives for all terminated employees and their supervisor, I told Janet Kim from HR during our Monday morning meeting. Electronic records going back 7 years, including metadata, server logs, and deletion records. Janet looked uncomfortable. That's a very extensive request. Most of those employee accounts have been deactivated for years. But the server archives still exist? Yes, but accessing them requires special authorization from IT security. And frankly, I'm not sure we have the legal authority to provide personal communications for former employees without their consent. I pulled out my regulatory authority documentation. Miss Kim, this is a formal compliance audit triggered by anonymous complaints alleging financial irregularities and management misconduct. I have full legal authority to examine any records relevant to this investigation, including personnel communications. Meridian Financial is required to provide complete cooperation with this process. I understand, but if you prefer, I can have the state regulatory office issue a formal subpoena for the records, but that would escalate this from a routine compliance audit to a formal investigation, which I don't think anyone wants. Janet sighed and made a note in her file. I'll work with IT to get you access to the archived records. 2 days later, I was sitting in front of a computer terminal with direct access to Meridian's email server archives, looking at 7 years of electronic communications for Marcus's division. What I found there exceeded even my most optimistic expectations for building a case against him. The metadata told an unmistakable story of systematic evidence fabrication. Jennifer Martinez's personnel file contained printed copies of 12 emails that allegedly showed her arguing with Marcus about investment strategies for the Hartwell Industries account. According to the server records, Jennifer had sent exactly 3 emails to Marcus during the relevant time period, none of which matched the content of the printed emails in her file. The fabricated emails had been created in Marcus's account and sent to his own personal folder, never actually transmitted to Jennifer or anyone else. They existed solely as draft documents in his private storage, created specifically to provide false evidence for her termination. But the technical evidence was even more damning than the existence of fake emails. The metadata showed that all 12 fabricated messages had been created on the same date, 2 days after Jennifer had been fired. Marcus had literally sat in his office after destroying her career and methodically composed fake correspondence to justify what he'd already done. David Park's case showed an identical pattern. Lisa Chen, Michael Rodriguez, and every other terminated employee showed the same signature. Fake emails created in Marcus's private folders, never actually sent, all composed after their terminations to provide retroactive justification for decisions he'd already made. The electronic evidence was so clear, so unambiguous, that I actually laughed out loud when I saw it. Marcus had been so confident in his ability to control the narrative that he'd never bothered to cover his digital tracks. He'd assumed that his word would be enough, that his position and reputation would protect him from any serious scrutiny. He'd never imagined that someone like me would come back with the authority and expertise to examine the actual server records. But beyond the fabricated emails, I found something even more disturbing. Evidence that Marcus had been systematically stealing credit for his subordinates' successful work while scapegoating them for his own failures. The server archives contained the real correspondence between Marcus and his staff, showing the actual decision-making processes for major accounts. In case after case, I found patterns where successful strategies had been developed by junior staff but claimed by Marcus in his reports to senior management, while failed strategies that clearly originated from Marcus had been retroactively attributed to subordinates through fabricated evidence. Jennifer Martinez had developed the investment approach that generated a $3.2 million gain for the Morrison Family Trust. Marcus had taken full credit for that success in his quarterly report, while simultaneously preparing to fire Jennifer for supposedly causing losses on a completely different account. David Park had identified compliance risks in the Patterson Industries account, the same account that had eventually been used to destroy my career. His recommendations had been ignored by Marcus, and when the problems materialized exactly as David had predicted, David had been terminated for failing to follow established protocols. The pattern was consistent across dozens of accounts over multiple years. Marcus had built his career by stealing credit from talented subordinates and destroying them when they became inconvenient or when his own mistakes required someone to blame. On Thursday afternoon, I requested another meeting with Marcus to discuss my preliminary findings. I wanted to see his face when I told him what I'd discovered. He entered the conference room with his usual attempt at projecting confidence, but I could see the strain around his eyes. A week of knowing I was reviewing his division's records had clearly taken its toll. "Miss Chen," he said, settling into his chair, "I trust the investigation is proceeding smoothly?" "Very smoothly, thank you." I opened my laptop and pulled up a summary document I'd prepared. "I wanted to update you on some concerns that have emerged from my review of personnel records and electronic communications." Marcus's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on his coffee mug. concerns. Discrepancies between documented personnel communications and the actual electronic records maintained on your email server. Significant discrepancies. The color began draining from his face. I'm not sure I understand. Mr. Kellerman, are you aware that Meridian's email servers maintain complete archives of all electronic communications, including metadata that tracks when messages are created, modified, sent, and received? Yes, of course. Good, because those records show clear evidence that personnel documentation for terminated employees contains fabricated email correspondence that was never actually sent or received. Marcus was very still, like an animal that suddenly realized it's been trapped. That's a very serious accusation, he said quietly. It's not an accusation, it's a documented finding. For example, Jennifer Martinez's personnel file contains 12 emails that allegedly show her arguing with you about investment strategies. According to the server records, those emails were created in your private account folder 2 days after she was terminated and were never transmitted to her or anyone else. I turned my laptop toward him, showing the server metadata that proved the emails were fabricated. Marcus stared at the screen for a long moment, and I watched his entire worldview collapse in real time. The same pattern exists for David Park, Lisa Chen, and every other employee terminated from your division over the past 7 years. In each case, the email evidence used to justify their termination was fabricated after the fact to provide retroactive justification for decisions you'd already made. Marcus set down his coffee mug with shaking hands. There must be some technical error in the server records. I've had our IT forensics specialist verify the metadata independently. There's no error. The evidence clearly shows systematic fabrication of personnel documentation over multiple years. Sarah, his voice cracked slightly on my name, you have to understand. I understand perfectly. You've been systematically framing subordinates for your own mistakes, stealing credit for their successes, and destroying careers to protect your own position. The electronic evidence documents this pattern conclusively. Marcus leaned forward, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely desperate. You don't understand the pressure I was under. The expectations from senior management, the performance targets, So you destroyed 8 people's careers to manage your performance targets? It wasn't supposed to be like this. I never meant for it to go this far. I stared at him across the table. This man who had once seemed so powerful, so untouchable. 3 years ago, he'd looked at me with smug satisfaction as he destroyed my life with fabricated evidence. Now he was pleading for understanding from the woman he'd tried to erase. Marcus, did you fabricate email evidence to justify my termination 3 years ago? He was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. Yes, he whispered. Did you instruct me to pursue the aggressive strategy for the Patterson Industries account? Then create fake emails showing the opposite? Yes. How many other people have you done this to? I don't know. I lost track. I closed my laptop and began packing up my materials. Mr. Kellerman, I'm required to inform you that this investigation has uncovered evidence of serious misconduct that will be reported to both Meridian's executive leadership and state regulatory authorities. I recommend that you consult with legal counsel immediately. As I stood to leave, Marcus grabbed my arm. Sarah, please. You know what this will do to my career, my family. I have 2 kids in college, a mortgage. I looked down at his hand on my arm, then met his eyes directly. 3 years ago, did you consider what destroying my career would do to my life? Did you think about my student loans, my apartment, my future? He released my arm and sank back into his chair. I made a mistake, he said. I was wrong to do what I did to you, but please don't destroy me the way I... He stopped, realizing what he was about to say. The way you destroyed me? I finished. That's exactly what I'm going to do, Marcus. I'm going to document every lie you've told, every person you've ruined, every piece of evidence you fabricated, and then I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly who you really are. Walking out of that conference room was the most satisfying moment of my professional life. Marcus Kellerman, the man who had once seemed so powerful, so untouchable, was sitting alone with the wreckage of his carefully constructed lies, finally understanding that his victims had found a way to fight back. The investigation was nearly complete, but the best part was yet to come. In 3 days, I would be presenting my final report to Meridian's board of directors, and Marcus's career would be officially and publicly destroyed. After 3 years of planning, preparation, and careful positioning, my revenge was about to be complete. The boardroom at Meridian Financial was exactly as I'd imagined it would be. Polished mahogany table, leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay. 8 board members, 3 senior executives, 2 representatives from the state regulatory office, and 1 nervous-looking Marcus Kellerman who'd clearly spent the past 3 days consulting with lawyers and probably updating his resume. I stood at the head of the table with my presentation materials arranged precisely, wearing my best charcoal gray suit and carrying the 127-page audit report that would demolish Marcus's career and reputation. 3 years of preparation had led to this moment, and I intended to savor every second of it. "Good morning," I began, my voice steady and professional. "I'm Sarah Chen, Senior Auditor with Cromwell and Associates, here to present the findings of our regulatory compliance investigation into the Pacific Northwest Division of Meridian Financial." I clicked to my first slide. Investigation Summary, Evidence of Systematic Management Misconduct. Several board members shifted forward in their seats. Marcus stared at the table, his face pale and drawn. Over the past 3 weeks, I've conducted a comprehensive review of personnel records, electronic communications, financial transactions, and management practices within the Pacific Northwest Division. The investigation was triggered by anonymous complaints alleging potential irregularities and misconduct. I advanced to the next slide. Key findings: documentation fraud, systematic employee abuse, pattern of evidence fabrication. The investigation has uncovered conclusive evidence that Division Vice President Marcus Kellerman engaged in systematic misconduct over a period of 7 years, including the fabrication of email evidence used to terminate employees, the misappropriation of credit for subordinates' successful work, and the systematic scapegoating of staff to cover for management failures. I could see Marcus's attorney whispering urgently in his ear, but Marcus himself remained motionless, staring at his hands. Let me begin with the most serious finding: evidence fabrication for personnel actions. I clicked to a detailed slide showing server metadata alongside printed emails from Jennifer Martinez's personnel file. Mr. Kellerman systematically created false email correspondence to justify employee terminations. These fabricated emails were never actually sent or received, but were created in his private folders specifically to provide false documentation for disciplinary actions. I walked through the technical evidence methodically, showing how the metadata proved the emails were fake, how the timeline demonstrated they were created after terminations were already decided, and how the pattern repeated across multiple cases. Board Chairman Robert Hayes interrupted. "Ms. Chen, are you saying that Mr. Kellerman completely fabricated email correspondence with his subordinates?" "Yes, sir. In the case of Jennifer Martinez, for example, Mr. Kellerman's personnel documentation contains 12 emails, allegedly showing her arguing for risky investment strategies against his advice. The server records show that Ms. Martinez sent exactly 3 emails to Mr. Kellerman during the relevant period, none of which match the fabricated versions in her file." I advanced to the next slide, showing a comparison between real and fabricated emails. The fake emails were all created on March 15, 2022, 2 days after Ms. Martinez was terminated. Mr. Kellerman literally sat in his office after firing her and composed fictional correspondence to justify a decision he'd already made. The silence in the room was deafening. I could see board members exchanging glances, their expressions ranging from shock to disgust. This pattern exists for every employee terminated from Mr. Kellerman's division over the past 7 years. 8 separate instances of evidence fabrication affecting 8 different careers. I clicked to the next section of my presentation: pattern of credit theft and scapegoating. Beyond fabricating evidence to justify terminations, Mr. Kellerman systematically stole credit for subordinates' successful work while blaming them for his own failures. I showed documented examples: Jennifer Martinez developing investment strategies that Marcus claimed credit for, David Park identifying risks that Marcus ignored, Lisa Chen generating client relationships that Marcus took over. In each case, Mr. Kellerman appropriated successful work in his reports to senior management while simultaneously preparing to destroy the careers of the people who'd actually done the work. Board member Elizabeth Morrison leaned forward. "Ms. Chen, do you have specific documentation of these credit theft allegations?" Extensive documentation. I advanced to a slide showing email exchanges between Marcus and senior management. These are Mr. Kellerman's actual communications with executive leadership, taking credit for strategies and outcomes that were developed by his subordinates. Cross-referenced with the internal communications showing the real origins of these strategies. I walked through case after case, showing how Marcus had built his reputation by systematically stealing from the people who worked for him, then destroying them when they became inconvenient or when his own mistakes required scapegoats. The financial impact of Mr. Kellerman's misconduct extends beyond the human cost to his victims. By terminating talented employees and misrepresenting the origins of successful strategies, he has undermined the division's actual performance while inflating his own perceived value to the company. I click to my final section, regulatory and legal implications. This investigation has uncovered evidence of multiple violations of state employment law, federal regulations governing personnel practices in financial institutions, and Meridian Financial's own code of conduct. The systematic nature of the misconduct and the deliberate fabrication of evidence suggest potential criminal liability beyond civil employment violations. The room was absolutely silent. I could see Marcus's attorney taking rapid notes, probably calculating his client's legal exposure. Marcus himself looked like he might vomit. My final recommendation is that Meridian Financial immediately terminate Mr. Kellerman's employment, conduct a comprehensive review of all personnel actions taken under his supervision, and cooperate fully with any criminal investigation that may be initiated by state authorities. I closed my laptop and looked directly at Marcus for the first time during the presentation. Mr. Kellerman destroyed 8 careers through systematic fraud and abuse of power. He fabricated evidence, stole credit, and manipulated documentation to protect his own position while devastating the lives of talented professionals who trusted him. Marcus finally looked up, meeting my eyes across the boardroom table. I could see recognition there, not just of what I'd uncovered, but of who I was and what this moment meant. 3 years ago, I was one of those victims. Mr. Kellerman used fabricated email evidence to destroy my career and have me blacklisted from the industry. He assumed that would be the end of my story. I smiled, feeling 3 years of careful planning and preparation crystallize into this perfect moment of vindication. He was wrong. Board Chairman Hayes cleared his throat. Mr. Kellerman, do you wish to respond to these allegations? Marcus looked at his attorney, who shook his head almost imperceptibly. Then he looked back at me, and I saw something that might have been respect alongside the fear and desperation. No, he said quietly. I have nothing to say. Hayes nodded grimly. This board will convene an emergency session to review Ms. Chen's findings and determine appropriate action. Mr. Kellerman, you are suspended from all duties effective immediately pending our final decision. As the meeting broke up, I packed my materials with steady hands, watching Marcus being escorted out by security. His career was over, his reputation destroyed, his carefully constructed lies exposed for everyone to see. But more than that, 8 victims had been vindicated. 8 talented professionals who'd been systematically destroyed by a manipulative supervisor had been proven right. Their careers might not be recoverable, but at least the truth was finally known. Walking out of Meridian Financial that afternoon, I thought about the naive young woman who'd been escorted out of this same building 3 years ago, carrying her personal effects in a cardboard box and believing her career was over. She'd been wrong, too. Her career wasn't over, it was just beginning. 6 months later, the morning Seattle Times arrived at my new office with a front-page story about Marcus Kellerman's sentencing. Former financial executive gets 18 months for employment fraud. The article detailed his conviction on multiple felony counts related to fabricating employment records, his disbarment from the financial industry, and the $2.3 million civil judgment against him for damages to his victims. I set the newspaper aside and returned to reviewing the case files for my newest assignment. After the Meridian investigation, Cromwell and Associates had been flooded with requests for my specific expertise in uncovering management fraud and employment misconduct. I'd been promoted to principal auditor and given my own team, specializing in cases where powerful executives had systematically abused their subordinates. Apparently, Marcus Kellerman hadn't been as unique as I'd thought. Corporate America was full of people who advanced their careers by destroying others, and regulatory agencies were finally starting to take these cases seriously. My phone buzzed with a text message from Jennifer Martinez. Saw the sentencing news. Thank you for giving us our lives back. Jennifer had returned to financial services after my audit report vindicated her termination. She was now a senior vice president at a boutique investment firm, finally receiving the recognition her talents deserved. David Park had also rebuilt his career, as had most of Marcus's other victims. The justice wasn't complete. We could never fully recover the years that had been stolen from us, the opportunities that had been lost, the damage to our confidence and professional networks. But we had something more valuable: vindication, and the knowledge that our tormentor had been held accountable for what he'd done. My assistant knocked on my office door. "Sarah, your 2 p.m. appointment is here." I looked up to see a young woman in her late 20s, nervous and uncertain, carrying herself with the particular combination of defeat and desperate hope that I recognized from my own dark period. "Miss Patterson, please come in." She settled into the chair across from my desk and pulled out a folder of documents. "I was terminated from Morrison Financial 6 months ago. My supervisor said I'd made unauthorized trades that cost a client $800,000, but I never made those trades. I saved all my communications, and I think I can prove that my boss is lying, but no one will listen to me." I smiled and pulled out a fresh legal pad. "Tell me everything from the beginning, and don't worry, I believe you." As she began her story, I thought about the chain of justice that had brought us to this moment. Marcus Kellerman had destroyed my career, thinking it would protect him from accountability. Instead, it had created someone with the skills, authority, and motivation to destroy him far more completely than he'd ever imagined possible. And now that same cycle was continuing. Every executive who thought they could abuse their power, every supervisor who believed they could scapegoat subordinates, every manager who assumed their victims would simply disappear. They were creating their own nemesis. People like me, armed with forensic accounting skills, regulatory authority, and an absolute commitment to uncovering the truth. Marcus Kellerman had taught me that documentation was power, that evidence was everything, and that the right investigation could destroy someone completely. It was a lesson I'd never forget, and one I was eager to keep teaching to others who needed to learn it. The cycle of justice continued, and I was exactly where I belonged. In the center of it, making sure that the powerful could no longer prey on the powerless with impunity. My phone rang with another new case, another victim seeking vindication, another opportunity to prove that some stories have very different endings than the villains expect. I answered with a smile. "Sarah Chen, Principal Auditor. How can I help you get your life back?"